It's Monday, December 15th. I'm Jake Ward. This is the Rip Current. We look at the big invisible forces at work on us. In this country, we have been good at regulating against two things: death and financial loss. But increasingly, regulations are starting to look at what I think is going to be the next great concern of the upcoming few years, and that is our psychological relationship to technology. What technology does to our sense of reality, our sense of connection with one another, and our ability to trust our instincts as they are reprogrammed, in some cases for profit, by the technologies we push on one another. And I want to look today at some of the headlines that I'm seeing that reflect this shift toward understanding these kinds of risks. I want to start with a speech by the new head of MI6. That's the big intelligence agency in Britain. Blaise Metroelli is the new head there. I actually don't know if that's how you say her name properly. I apologize if that's the case. But, she is M, right, as in the James Bond movies. She is the new head of intelligence at MI6. And she gave her first speech on the job, and prominent in that was AI. She talked about Britain being caught in a, quote, space between peace and war, complicated by the rise of artificial intelligence and other technologies, dominated by powerful individuals and corporations. She's looking here at the Venn diagram of power, influence, technology that is not just a question of, who are our enemies of Britain looking to do us harm, but how will they do it, in some cases in ways that they that aren't even the sort of the actions of a nation state, but are simply the sort of secondary effect of the way these technologies work. She said the world, quote, was more dangerous and contested now than for decades, with emerging technologies rewriting the reality of conflict as they converge to create science fiction-like tools. She, talked about we've had all sorts of, hardcore sort of specific threats that somebody like the head of MI6 would have looked at. But in this case, she talked about not just things like robots and drones powered by AI that could be devastating on the battlefield. She also talked about hyper-personalized tools that could become a new vector for conflict and control. And the reason I'm getting into this is that this is someone who really deals in the nuts and bolts of what is a threat to in her case, her country, to Britain, and seeing beyond just questions of fraud and physical danger and into a world in which reality is rewritten in a fundamental way. That's sort of part of what she's thinking about here. And so for me, it's looking at the ways in which I think lawmakers and everyday people are beginning to recognize how reality is kind of being rewritten. All of that feels really important. So here's another one that I caught is this AP report about militant groups experimenting with AI and how the risks are expected to grow. They cite things like an attack in Russia that was attributed to ISIS, and basically out of that attack last year, AI propaganda videos began making the rounds. They began using the attack as a way of kind of as an inciting instant for creating these kind of recruitment videos. And the thing that, experts have warned us for a long time is that it's not going to require a command or even a cultural familiarity with English or the Western world or really any other country to be effective when it comes to being persuasive using AI. I went to a Stanford conference recently in which there was a presentation by researchers who had found that persuasive political messaging written by AI is in fact more persuasive than political messaging written by humans. If you've followed me for a little while, you know that one of the things I think about a lot is the ways in which the human circuitry really can be played upon in ways that we are totally unaware of. And if anything, we're even sort of trained to believe that we're much more kind of immune to that the circuitry isn't in charge of us and can't be played, but it really, really can. And we're finding more and more that is the case. And the fact that that we're seeing militant groups beginning to, especially when it's combined with social media algorithms, can really recruit new believers. It can confuse and frighten people. It really can move propaganda in a very new, sort of powerful way that we've really never seen before. Beyond that, there is the use of propaganda at the government level. The Guardian has this write-up of how U.S. federal agencies are mimicking Trump on social media. If you saw, after the controversy came out around this September attack on the boats, Venezuelan boats, the Secretary of War, as he is now known, Pete Hegseth, put out a piece of propaganda, an AI-generated image of a beloved children's character, like exploding boats from a helicopter. And the same kind of propaganda and incitement and all of that stuff that we've seen militant groups start to push are being pushed, in this case, by what are supposed to be very cold, very neutral federal agencies, suddenly mimicking the kind of craziness that we see from the president. And that's why the Oxford English Dictionary has crowned its word of the year for 2025, which is rage bait. The use of this technology to set off our rage, to set off our feelings, is a huge part of the sort of playbook of communications now. And for me, the way that we've, I think, sort of pushed back on this stuff in the past has been regulation. And I think that there is there has been tremendous traction being developed. I was on PBS NewsHour on Friday talking to the anchor there about Trump's efforts to try and grab away from the states the power to regulate AI and give it only to the federal government. And this is, of course, because it is the states that are really moving on this stuff. There are no federal regulations when it comes to AI, and it is the states moving the fastest. And state attorneys general are the ones really moving fast. So last week, a coalition of 42 U.S. attorneys general wrote to the big artificial intelligence companies and demanded better safeguards and testing of chatbots. And what they're claiming here is not just financial loss. They're not talking about physical harm. They're talking about harmful interactions psychologically, the delusional and emotionally damaging interactions that companies are spotting. Even they are reporting in their users. The write-up here from the Financial Times says, the warning from the top legal officials in more than 36 U.S. states and territories adds to growing pressure on companies over users who develop damaging emotional attachment with AI chatbots and so-called companions. One of the things I've been documenting for a long time is that there's been traditionally a real hostility in the United States to thinking about emotional or psychological harm as a thing. We used to make fun of that, as a sort of a subject of frivolous lawsuits. But increasingly, it is becoming a source of real concern. In this case, 42 U.S. attorneys general are actively saying to these companies, listen, you're doing harm to people on this stuff. And that is, I think, a very enlightened and important regulatory move. And it's one that the Trump administration doesn't seem to want to, doesn't want, and is increasingly hostile, and seems to have sort of bought the line from the big tech companies that these companies should get an open highway to the future, because the utopia on the far side of the transformation they promise is going to be worth it, is sort of the logic of that stuff. So for me, I'm sort of watching these storylines as a reflection of a growing realization that I think all of us can feel, right? That something is wrong here. We've seen, reports from, we've seen polling that shows that people aren't just worried about the job displacement, the economic impacts, but are worried about like how AI is going to infringe upon their privacy and, bring bias into decision making and affect the psychological landscape, the development of our kids' brains, the ways in which we agree together that something is true or is not. All of that, I think people are recognizing as kind of under threat. And I think we're going to see over the coming months and years a subdividing of those concerns into some real concrete harms that we're going to see people litigate about, unless, of course, the Trump administration manages to truly railroad all regulation out of existence on this stuff. So that's the thing I'll be watching very closely. I'll be back with more of these kinds of headlines and this sort of analysis. You can subscribe at theripcurrent.com. And thanks a lot for watching.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.